"I can't hold it in anymore," she gasped. The rancher hesitated and did something horrifying. The little town she grew up in was quiet, surrounded by wide fields and endless skies, but it felt small, almost suffocating at times. She dreamed of seeing places she had only read about in books, meeting people who had different experiences, and making a life that was entirely her own. But for now, her reality was the Dalton Ranch, a sprawling piece of land on the edge of town where she had come to work a few months ago. The ranch was famous in the area, not for its beauty or size, but for its strict owner, Mr. Dalton. People in the town spoke of him with a mixture of respect and fear. He was a tall man with sharp features and eyes that seemed to notice everything. Some said he was fair, others whispered that he could be cruel when crossed. Emily had met him only a few times before she started working, and those brief encounters left her with a strange feeling, something she couldn't quite put into words. The first day at the ranch had been overwhelming. The sun was already high in the sky, beating down on the endless fields, and Emily felt every drop of sweat as she tried to keep up with the work. She had grown up helping her parents in small ways, tending a garden or feeding animals, but the scale of Dalton Ranch was something else entirely. Horses, cattle, and sheep roamed the land, and every morning Emily had to help with chores that seemed to go on forever. At first, the physical exhaustion was all she could focus on. Her muscles ached, her hands were raw from the rope and tools, and her feet were sore from walking over rough terrain. But gradually, she began to notice the small details of life at the ranch. The way the horses shifted nervously when Mr. Dalton approached, the cautious glances of the workers, and the silence that often fell when he was around. Emily was assigned to the stables, a place where the horses were kept, fed, and groomed. She loved animals, and spending time with them gave her some peace, but even here, tension lingered. Mr. Dalton would sometimes enter without warning, inspecting every corner, and his voice, though calm, carried a weight that made everyone uneasy. "Make sure the stalls are clean," he would say, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. "I want everything perfect." His expectations were high and mistakes were never overlooked. Emily tried her best, and at first she was praised for her diligence, which gave her a small sense of relief. She thought that maybe the stories about Mr. Dalton were exaggerated, that perhaps he was just a strict man who cared about his work. But as weeks went by, Emily began noticing subtle signs that unsettled her. She saw Mr. Dalton speaking sharply to one of the farmhands, a man who had been working there for years. The man's shoulders slumped, and he didn't speak back. Another time, Emily heard the rancher shouting in the distance, and when she went closer to see what had happened, she found him standing over a worker who was trembling, holding a piece of broken equipment. "Do it right next time, Mr. Dalton said, and then walked away as if nothing had happened. The worker stayed on the ground for a long moment, as if trying to gather the courage to continue. Emily tried to tell herself that these incidents were normal, part of the tough life on a ranch. But a small, uneasy feeling in her chest refused to go away. She noticed that some workers avoided eye contact with Mr. Dalton, and some whispered quietly when they thought no one was listening. One evening, she overheard two men talking near the barn. "You can't trust him when he's alone," one said. "He's not the man people think he is." Emily froze in place, her heart racing. She had never imagined the ranch could be a place where fear and caution ruled more than respect. Despite these growing worries, Emily tried to focus on her own work. She cleaned stalls, fed the animals, and helped repair fences. She was good at her job, and she wanted to prove that she belonged there. Some days when the sun was setting and the golden light spilled over the fields, she could almost forget the tension. She would stand for a moment, watching the horses run, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. These were the moments she lived for, brief escapes from the reality of the ranch. But Mr. Dalton was always there in some way. Sometimes it was just his presence, a shadow that seemed to stretch across the fields. Other times it was his words, sharp and cutting even when they weren't meant to be cruel. "Emily," he said one day, calling her from the barn. She hurried over, wiping her hands on her apron. "Check the fencing on the north side." "Something doesn't feel right." There was no explanation, no discussion, only the command. She nodded and ran off to complete the task, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back. Over time, the small incidents began to add up. Emily started noticing patterns, the way Mr. Dalton's mood could shift without warning, how his calm voice could turn icy, and how the ranch workers seemed to navigate around him like they were walking on thin ice. Emily couldn't help but feel a growing tension in her stomach, a sense that something bad could happen at any moment. She didn't know why, but instinct told her to be careful, to watch her words, and to keep a distance whenever possible. One afternoon, while fixing a broken fence, Emily's thoughts wandered. She thought about the life she wanted, far away from the ranch, from the small town, from the constant unease. She wondered if she was brave enough to make it happen. Could she leave everything she knew behind? Could she survive without the familiarity of her daily routine? These questions lingered as she worked, the wind in her hair, the smell of hay and earth filling her senses. She wanted to believe that the ranch was just a temporary challenge, a stepping stone to something better. But deep down, she knew that the unease she felt was not going away. It was a shadow that followed her through every chore, every interaction, and every quiet moment in the stables. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Emily paused to catch her breath. She wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked around at the ranch, taking in the vast fields, the sturdy barns, and the animals that depended on the care of humans. She loved the animals, and she loved the work in its own way, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something darker lingered here. She realized that she would have to stay alert, careful, and strong if she wanted to make it through. It was not just about the work. It was about navigating the invisible currents of fear and power that moved through Dalton Ranch. That evening, as Emily walked back to the small cabin where she lived, she thought about the days ahead. She knew she couldn't run away just yet. She needed the job and she wanted to do well. But she also knew that she had to trust her instincts, to notice the signs, and to prepare herself for whatever might come. For the first time, Emily understood that life at Dalton Ranch was not just about hard work. It was about survival, courage, and finding a way to hold onto her own sense of self, in a place where control and fear were always present. As night fell and the stars appeared above the quiet fields, Emily lay awake, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of the cows, the rustle of animals in their pens, and the distant creak of a barn door swinging in the wind. She felt a mix of fear and determination. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to be ready for herself, and for the life she wanted beyond these fields. The calm before the storm was ending, and Emily could feel the tension building in the air. She had stepped into a world that was bigger and more complex than she had imagined, and now she would have to navigate it carefully, learning its rules, its dangers, and its secrets. The days at Dalton Ranch seemed to stretch endlessly, each one blending into the next with the same routine, yet the tension that Emily had first felt was now growing stronger. She had learned to navigate the chores with care, always mindful of Mr. Dalton's presence, but the unease she carried in her chest refused to disappear. It wasn't only his sharp words or sudden moods. It was the way he observed everything around him, the way his eyes seemed to follow her even when she thought she was alone. Emily had always been aware of other people's emotions, and now she sensed that the ranch itself was alive with unspoken fear. One morning, as the sun rose over the wide fields, Emily was helping feed the animals when she noticed Jason, one of the older ranch hands, moving unusually quietly. He usually hummed or whistled while he worked, but that day he barely spoke, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. Emily tried to greet him, hoping a simple conversation would ease the tension, but he only nodded briefly and kept working. Something was clearly wrong. Later that afternoon, Emily found herself repairing a broken gate on the far edge of the property. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of hay and earth, and for a brief moment she felt at peace. But that peace was shattered when she heard Mr. Dalton's voice from behind. "Emily," he called. The sharpness in his tone made her stomach tighten. She turned quickly, dropping the hammer she had been using, and walked toward him. "You missed a post," he said, gesturing toward the wooden fence she had been fixing. Emily felt a surge of frustration. She had measured everything carefully, but she nodded obediently. "I'll fix it," she said softly. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once and walked away without another word. Emily exhaled, but the tension lingered. She realized that even small mistakes, real or imagined, could draw his scrutiny, and that made her nervous every time she worked. As the week went on, Emily noticed more signs that things at the ranch were not as simple as they seemed. One evening she was walking past the barn when she heard muffled voices. She paused, straining to listen. One of the voices sounded panicked. "You can't let him see that," someone whispered. Another voice replied, calm but firm, "He's just being cautious." "Don't worry too much." Emily's heart raced. She didn't recognize the voices, and she didn't know exactly what they were talking about, but she felt a chill run down her spine. Something was happening here that she was not supposed to know about. Emily tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on her chores and her love for the animals. The horses brought her comfort, their gentle eyes and soft nuzzles reminding her that there was still kindness in the world. Yet, even among the animals, she felt a strange tension. The older horses would flinch at sudden movements. The dogs would growl softly at nothing she could see. It was as if they too sensed the unease that hung in the air, a feeling she could not ignore. One afternoon, while working with the cattle, Emily noticed Sarah, another young worker, acting strangely. Sarah usually smiled easily and joked with the others, but that day she was quiet, moving from task to task without looking at anyone. Emily hesitated for a moment, then asked softly, "Are you okay?" Sarah's eyes darted toward hers, and for a brief second Emily saw fear there. Sarah shook her head and muttered, "I'll be fine." But the tension in her voice told Emily otherwise. It was becoming clear that the workers all carried their own hidden worries, their own stories of discomfort that they kept silent about. The growing fear at the ranch began to affect Emily in ways she hadn't expected. She started waking up in the middle of the night, thinking about her work, wondering if she had done everything right, worrying about what might happen next. The quiet moments, once peaceful, now felt heavy with anticipation. Every creak of the barn, every rustle of the animals, and every distant shout made her heart race. She felt trapped in a web of anxiety she could not escape. One evening, Mr. Dalton called Emily to the barn alone. Her stomach tightened as she walked through the dimly lit space. "I need you to help me with the north field tomorrow," he said. There was no warmth in his tone, only a command that left no room for discussion. Emily nodded, trying to hide the nervousness rising in her chest. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of fear inside her. He studied her for a long moment, and then simply turned and left. She exhaled deeply, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after he was gone. Emily began paying closer attention to the other workers. She noticed that some of them avoided certain areas of the ranch, moving quickly past without explanation. Others whispered in corners, casting nervous glances around. One afternoon, she saw Jason speaking quietly with another worker near the fence. When he noticed her watching, he immediately straightened up, his face neutral, and walked away. It was clear that something was being hidden, but Emily had no idea what it could be. Despite the tension, Emily tried to maintain her focus. She found solace in the small moments of connection with the animals, the satisfaction of a well-repaired fence, or the simple beauty of the sunset over the fields. But she couldn't ignore the pattern of fear around her. Every worker she spoke to seemed careful, measured, as if a single word could cause trouble. She realized that Dalton Ranch was not just a place of work. It was a place where control and fear ruled more than kindness or fairness. Emily's anxiety began to affect her confidence. She doubted herself more often, questioning whether she was strong enough to handle the work and the invisible pressures around her. But at the same time, a quiet determination started to grow. She couldn't let fear control her completely. She reminded herself that she was capable, that she had worked hard to get here, and that she had the right to feel safe in her workplace. These thoughts became her anchor as the days grew more tense. Then one afternoon, Emily witnessed something that shook her deeply. She was in the barn, arranging feed for the horses, when she heard a commotion outside. She stepped out and saw Mr. Dalton speaking harshly to one of the workers, a young man who had been at the ranch for years. The worker's face was pale and his hands trembled as he held a piece of equipment. "Do it properly next time," Mr. Dalton snapped, his tone cold and unyielding. The worker nodded quickly, swallowing hard, and continued his task. Emily felt a surge of anger and sadness. She realized that the fear she sensed in everyone around her was real, and it was being caused by the man who held power over them. Emily's thoughts turned inward. She asked herself how she had gotten here, how a place that had seemed like an opportunity for growth and independence had become a source of anxiety and fear. She wondered if she should speak up, if she should confront Mr. Dalton or warn the others. But she also knew the risks. The rancher's influence was strong, and challenging him could have consequences she wasn't prepared to face. The weight of responsibility pressed on her, and she realized that surviving at Dalton Ranch would require not just hard work, but careful observation, patience, and courage. As the sun set, Emily walked back to her small cabin, her mind restless. She thought about Sarah, about Jason, about all the workers who seemed trapped in a world of silent fear. She thought about herself and the future she wanted to build, far away from the ranch, far away from the tension that filled each day. But she also knew she had to stay, at least for now. She had to learn to understand and to prepare for whatever might come next. That night, as Emily lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the rustling of animals in their pens, the creak of barn doors swinging in the wind, she felt a mixture of fear and determination. The ranch was a place of hidden struggles, of quiet battles and unspoken rules, and she understood, for the first time, that surviving here would require more than strength. It would require courage, awareness, and the ability to trust her instincts, even when they told her uncomfortable truths. The calm days were ending, and Emily could feel the tension in the air growing. Every interaction, every task, every glance held more weight than before. She had stepped into a world where fear and control shaped the lives of those around her, and now she had to navigate it carefully, learning its rules and preparing herself for the challenges that lay ahead. The quiet unease that had first settled in her chest was now a constant companion, and Emily knew that she could no longer ignore it. The story of Dalton Ranch was unfolding, and she was at the center of it, whether she wanted to be or not. Emily's unease at Dalton Ranch had reached a point where it shadowed every part of her day. She moved carefully, measuring her steps and her words, always conscious of Mr. Dalton's presence. Even when he wasn't around, the atmosphere felt heavy, as if his attention lingered in the fields and barns long after he left. Emily had learned to observe, to notice patterns, and to anticipate potential tension. But nothing could prepare her for what was about to happen. It started on a late afternoon, with the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. The day had been long and exhausting, with chores stretching from dawn until the sun began its descent. Emily was helping organize hay bales near the back of the barn when she heard the familiar, slow footsteps that always made her stomach tighten. Mr. Dalton was approaching. She straightened, wiping her hands and forcing a calm expression, though her heart was pounding. "Emily," he called, his voice carrying over the quiet fields. There was a hesitation in his tone today, something she had never noticed before. It wasn't the usual sharp command, it was almost uncertain. Emily's curiosity flickered for a brief moment, but she quickly pushed it aside. She knew that any lapse could be dangerous. "Yes, Mr. Dalton," she said politely, approaching him cautiously. He stood still, looking out over the fields for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, "I need you to help me with something in the barn. Alone." His words were simple, but the tone sent a chill through Emily. Being alone with Mr. Dalton had always been uncomfortable, but today it felt different. She didn't know why, but instinct told her to be alert. She nodded quietly, trying to appear calm. "Of course," she replied. As they walked toward the barn, Emily's mind raced. She wondered what he wanted, why he seemed hesitant, and why her nerves were tighter than usual. The barn loomed ahead, quiet and dimly lit. Emily's eyes darted to the corners, noticing the familiar stacks of hay and the shadows that moved with the fading sunlight. Her hands clenched slightly at her sides. Inside, Mr. Dalton motioned for her to stand near a row of barrels. "I need help organizing these," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. Emily began to move the barrels, lifting and stacking them carefully. But as she worked, she noticed that he wasn't looking at the barrels. He was watching her closely, his eyes narrowing slightly. She tried to ignore the feeling of being scrutinized, focusing on the task at hand, but the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Suddenly, he spoke again, this time with a sharp edge. "Be careful. One wrong move and it could all fall." Emily's hands froze on the barrel she was lifting. She realized he wasn't talking about the barrels. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat formed on her forehead. She tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that she had to stay calm. Mistakes would only give him power over her, and she refused to give him that. Then, without warning, a loud noise from outside startled them both. A branch had fallen against the barn wall, making a sharp clatter. Emily flinched, and Mr. Dalton's expression shifted for a moment. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door. For a brief instant, he seemed human, almost vulnerable, as if he were struggling with something inside. Emily noticed it, and a strange mixture of fear and curiosity washed over her. What was he thinking? Why did he hesitate? She opened her mouth, intending to speak, but hesitated. Instead, she took a small step back, keeping her eyes on him. The barn felt smaller, the shadows longer, and every creak of the wood amplified the tension. Emily realized that the moment she spoke or acted, the situation could change entirely. She had to be careful, to trust her instincts and to stay alert. I can't hold it in anymore," she whispered suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying a weight of emotion she had been holding inside for weeks. She had spent so long keeping her fear, frustration, and unease bottled up that it poured out in a single breath. The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. "Mr. Dalton froze. His brows furrowed, and he seemed momentarily thrown off balance. Emily realized she had done something bold, something that broke the invisible rules of the ranch. The silence stretched, and in that moment she understood that she had a choice. She could back down, remain quiet, or she could stand her ground. Her pulse was pounding, but her resolve was firm. "You need to understand," she continued, her voice steadier now. "I am not here to cause trouble. I am just trying to do my job. But the fear and tension here, it's too much. We all feel it. You may not see it, but we notice how you treat people." Her words were careful, measured, but honest. She watched his face closely, noting the flicker of emotion that crossed it. For the first time, Mr. Dalton did something unexpected. He stepped back, almost as if he were considering her words. There was a hesitation, a pause that made Emily's heart skip a beat. She realized that he wasn't the unstoppable figure she had imagined. He was human, capable of doubt, hesitation, and perhaps even change. The barn was quiet, filled only with the sound of breathing and the distant rustle of the animals outside. Emily felt a mixture of fear and relief. She had spoken her truth, and for now nothing terrible had happened. But she knew the moment was fragile. Any sudden movement or word could shatter the balance and turn the situation dangerous. I didn't realize," he said finally, his voice lower, almost uncertain. Emily's eyes widened slightly. He rarely spoke like this. "I never meant to make anyone feel afraid," he continued, though his tone suggested he was struggling with the admission. Emily nodded slightly, keeping her expression calm. She had not expected an apology, but the moment of honesty was enough to shift the tension. For several long minutes, they stood in silence, neither moving, both caught in the weight of the unspoken. Emily's mind raced with possibilities. Had she done the right thing? Was it safe to stay in the barn? Could this moment change the dynamic at the ranch? She didn't know the answers, but she felt a spark of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, her courage had opened a door. Finally, Mr. Dalton broke the silence. "You're right," he said, his voice firmer now. "I have been too harsh. I'll try to do better." Emily blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. She didn't fully trust it yet, but she could feel a small shift, a crack in the wall of fear that had dominated the ranch. Emily carefully continued her work, finishing the task with him standing nearby but no longer looming over her. The tension had eased slightly, replaced by cautious understanding. As she stacked the last of the barrels, she realized that speaking out, even in fear, could make a difference. She had found her voice, and that voice had changed the moment, if only a little. When the work was done, Emily stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of purple and blue. She breathed deeply, feeling the tension leave her shoulders. The barn behind her still held the memory of the confrontation, but it no longer felt like a place of fear. Instead, it felt like a place where change was possible, where courage could shift the balance. As she walked back to her cabin, Emily thought about the days ahead. She knew the challenges at Dalton Ranch were far from over, but she had learned something important. Fear could be confronted, and courage could be found in even the smallest moments. She had discovered the strength inside herself to speak up, to assert her feelings, and to demand respect, not with anger but with honesty. That night, lying in her small bed, Emily reflected on the events in the barn. Her pulse slowly calmed, replaced by a quiet sense of determination. She understood that the ranch would continue to test her, that Mr. Dalton and the other workers would present challenges and obstacles. But she also knew that she had taken a critical step. She had stood up, had spoken her truth, and had faced the moment that had terrified her. The night was quiet, filled with the sounds of the ranch, soft rustling, distant animal calls, and the gentle creak of doors. Emily felt the tension of the day begin to fade, replaced by a growing sense of confidence. She had faced the fear she had carried for weeks, and though the journey was far from over, she had proven to herself that she could confront challenges with courage and honesty. The calm before the next storm was still there, lingering in the shadows of the barn and fields, but Emily now knew that she had the strength to face it. She had discovered a new part of herself, a part willing to speak, to act, and to demand respect, even in a world where fear often ruled. And with that discovery, she slept, ready to face whatever the next day at Dalton Ranch would bring. The days after the confrontation in the barn were unlike any Emily had experienced at Dalton Ranch. The air itself seemed different, heavier in some ways, yet filled with possibilities in others. She noticed subtle changes in the behavior of the ranch workers. Some glanced at her with quiet respect, as if acknowledging the courage she had shown, while others still kept their distance, wary of the consequences. Emily realized that standing up, even in a small way, had ripple effects she could feel but not fully control. Early one morning, Emily arrived at the ranch before the sun had fully risen. The sky was pale and cold, but the birdsong offered a faint sense of hope. She found Jason near the main gate, adjusting a fence post. He glanced at her, hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Morning, Emily," he said quietly. There was something different in his tone, a hint of relief or maybe gratitude. Emily returned the greeting, careful not to overstep, but she felt a small warmth spread through her chest. Even small acknowledgments could make a difference. Emily's day began with the usual tasks: feeding the animals, cleaning the stables, and checking fences across the property. Yet there was a tension underlying each chore, a subtle awareness that things could change at any moment. She noticed Mr. Dalton walking through the fields with a slower pace, his usual briskness tempered by a thoughtful air. Sometimes he glanced at her, but he did not approach immediately or speak sharply. Emily wondered what he was thinking. Had the confrontation truly affected him, or was he simply observing, calculating his next move? As the morning progressed, Emily found herself near the barn when Sarah appeared, carrying a bucket of feed. Emily smiled gently, hoping to offer some comfort. "Good morning," she said. Sarah hesitated, then nodded, placing the bucket down carefully. "Morning," she replied softly. There was a tension in her shoulders, but it seemed lighter than it had been for weeks. Emily sensed that Sarah, too, had been affected by the recent events. Courage, she realized, could inspire more courage in others. By midday, Emily noticed a small group of workers gathered near the hayloft, speaking in hushed tones. She approached carefully, pretending to focus on a task nearby, but she could hear snippets of conversation. "She actually said something," one whispered. Another replied, "I never thought anyone would. Maybe things will change." Emily's heart lifted. The words confirmed what she had begun to sense. The confrontation had sparked something within the workers. They were beginning to recognize that fear was not permanent and that speaking up, even quietly, was possible. Despite these subtle shifts, Emily knew the ranch was far from calm. Mr. Dalton's presence still carried weight, and the power dynamics of the place were unchanged. He could still influence the mood of every worker, decide the course of the day, and maintain control. Yet, something had shifted. Emily had glimpsed the humanity within him, and she had also witnessed her own strength. These realizations created a new sense of awareness, a careful optimism that balanced her caution. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the north fence, Emily noticed a sudden commotion near the barn. Curious, she walked closer and saw Mr. Dalton speaking with Jason in low tones. Their expressions were serious, and Emily felt a flicker of apprehension. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but she could tell from their body language that they were discussing something important. Jason glanced toward her briefly and then looked away, avoiding eye contact. Emily understood that she was on the periphery of decisions and conversations she might not yet be ready to witness. The rest of the day passed in a blur of chores and quiet observation. Emily focused on her work, keeping her thoughts organized and her movements deliberate. She was beginning to notice the subtle power of consistency and competence. By doing her work well, maintaining composure, and observing the environment, she could influence the ranch in small but meaningful ways. Even in a place dominated by fear and tension, skill and reliability created a form of respect that words alone could not. That evening, after the animals had been fed and the barn secured, Emily returned to her cabin, exhausted but reflective. She thought about the events of the past week, the confrontation in the barn, the reactions of the workers, and the subtle shifts she had observed in Mr. Dalton. It was clear to her that the rancher was not invincible. He could hesitate, he could reconsider, and he could even recognize the validity of others' feelings. This realization offered Emily a sense of empowerment she had never felt before. She understood that the way forward would require patience, strategy, and courage, but that change, even slow, was possible. The next few days brought small victories and challenges alike. Emily noticed that the workers began to move with slightly more confidence, completing tasks efficiently and quietly offering each other support. Sarah smiled occasionally, her laughter returning in fleeting moments. Jason became more approachable, sharing tips and guidance in ways he had not before. The ranch was far from perfect, but the atmosphere was evolving. Fear was still present, but it no longer ruled every interaction. Emily also observed changes in Mr. Dalton. He remained authoritative, but there were moments when he seemed thoughtful, almost reflective. He questioned less sharply, listened more, and sometimes acknowledged mistakes with a quiet nod or brief comment. Emily was cautious not to misinterpret these signs. She knew that change was slow and fragile, but she felt that the balance of power was subtly shifting. The ranch, which had once seemed almost unyielding, was becoming a place where dialogue and observation could influence outcomes. One afternoon, as Emily worked near the stables, she saw Mr. Dalton approaching with a stack of supplies. She tensed slightly but reminded herself to remain calm. To her surprise, he handed her a piece of equipment with a nod. "Good work on the fences," he said simply. The words were brief, but they carried weight. Emily felt a flicker of pride and hope. Recognition, even in small measures, reinforced the idea that effort and courage could influence others, even someone as commanding as Mr. Dalton. The days continued with a careful rhythm. Emily remained diligent, cautious, and observant. She learned to read the subtle cues of the workers and the rancher alike, understanding when to act, when to speak, and when to remain silent. She began to see the importance of patience, empathy, and courage in a place where tension had once dominated. The barn, the fields, and the animals all became spaces where she could apply her insight, finding small victories that strengthened her confidence. Emily also reflected on her own growth. She realized that the fear she had carried for weeks had transformed into a sense of awareness and resilience. The confrontation had been a turning point, but the work of understanding, navigating, and influencing the environment was ongoing. She felt a sense of pride in her own ability to adapt, observe, and act wisely. This internal growth became a source of strength that sustained her even in the most challenging moments. By the end of the week, Emily noticed a new rhythm at Dalton Ranch. The workers moved with slightly more confidence, the animals responded with familiar ease, and even Mr. Dalton seemed more measured in his interactions. Emily understood that change was gradual and fragile, but it was real. She had played a part in that transformation, not through force or anger, but through courage, honesty, and persistence. That night, as Emily lay in her cabin, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch, the rustling of the animals, the distant calls of the birds, and the gentle creak of the barn, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had faced fear, confronted tension, and influenced change in ways she had not thought possible. The ranch was still a challenging place, but it was no longer a place dominated entirely by fear. Emily understood that the story of Dalton Ranch was far from over. Challenges remained, tensions could rise again, and the balance of power could shift at any moment. But she had discovered her own strength, her ability to navigate complexity, and her capacity to inspire subtle change. She had learned that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, consistent, and grounded in integrity and observation. As she drifted to sleep, Emily felt a renewed determination. She knew that the days ahead would continue to test her, that she would need to remain vigilant, patient, and brave. But she also knew that she had taken critical steps toward influencing her environment, supporting those around her, and maintaining her own sense of self. The calm after the storm was fragile, but It was real, and Emily felt ready to face the next chapter of life at Dalton Ranch. The weeks that followed Emily's confrontation with Mr. Dalton marked a new chapter at Dalton Ranch. The atmosphere was still filled with the weight of responsibility, but it no longer carried the same oppressive tension that had once dominated every corner of the property. Workers moved with more confidence, speaking quietly to one another and offering small acts of support. Emily noticed these subtle changes and felt a quiet sense of pride. She had not only survived the tension of the ranch, but had also played a role in creating a small, meaningful shift. Emily continued to rise early each morning, as she always had, moving through the fields with a practiced efficiency. Her work was meticulous, and she had developed a rhythm that made the days feel more manageable. Yet, her mind was no longer solely focused on chores and tasks. She began observing the ranch in new ways, noticing the patterns in the workers' movements, the changes in Mr. Dalton's behavior, and the ways the animals responded to the environment. She understood now that the ranch was more than just a place of labor. It was a network of relationships, power, and care, each part influencing the others in subtle ways. One morning, Emily saw Mr. Dalton speaking with one of the newer workers, a young man who had been nervous and unsure since arriving at the ranch. Emily watched from a distance as Mr. Dalton explained a task with patience, answering the young man's questions thoroughly and offering encouragement. The young man's shoulders relaxed, and he nodded with understanding. Emily felt a small warmth of satisfaction. She realized that even someone as strict and intimidating as Mr. Dalton could change, could learn to guide rather than intimidate. The ripple effect of her courage had reached farther than she had imagined. As the days went by, Emily also noticed that the workers themselves began to take small initiatives. Sarah, who had once moved quietly through the ranch, began asking questions, offering suggestions, and helping guide the younger workers. Jason, who had been cautious and reserved, shared tips and advice openly, helping others complete their tasks more efficiently. Emily realized that courage and confidence were contagious. When one person stepped forward, others felt empowered to do the same. The environment, once dominated by fear, was gradually transforming into a place of collaboration and quiet respect. Despite these positive changes, Emily remained vigilant. She knew that progress was fragile and could be easily undone if people reverted to old patterns or if fear resurfaced. She continued to observe, to communicate carefully, and to act with both honesty and discretion. Emily understood that leadership was not about asserting power, but about fostering trust, consistency, and respect. By demonstrating these qualities, she could influence the ranch in ways that were meaningful and lasting. One afternoon, Emily was tasked with organizing a large shipment of hay, a job that required coordination and attention to detail. She worked alongside Sarah and Jason, giving instructions calmly and efficiently. The task, which might once have felt tense and overwhelming, now felt manageable. The workers moved together smoothly, listening, responding, and supporting one another. Emily noticed Mr. Dalton watching from a distance, and for the first time she saw a hint of approval in his expression. The acknowledgement was small but meaningful. It reminded her that change could be recognized and appreciated, even by those in authority. That evening, after the chores were complete and the animals settled, Emily walked through the fields, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the first days at the ranch, the fear, the uncertainty, the tension, and she realized how far she had come. She had faced challenges that tested her courage, observed patterns of behavior that others overlooked, and influenced her environment in ways that were subtle but powerful. She had learned that strength was not only physical, it was emotional, intellectual, and moral. The transformation at the ranch did not go unnoticed by the community. People began to speak differently about Dalton Ranch, noting the improved atmosphere and the changes in worker morale. Emily was proud to know that her courage had contributed to this shift. She also understood that her experience had given her more than just skills and confidence at work. It had given her insight into human behavior, leadership, and resilience. She knew that these lessons would carry her far beyond the ranch, into every aspect of her life. One evening, Emily found herself alone with Mr. Dalton near the barn. The air was still and quiet, and the sky above was painted in deep shades of purple and gold. She felt a sense of calm that had been absent for months. Mr. Dalton looked at her and nodded. "You've done well," he said simply. The words were brief but carried a weight of recognition. Emily smiled, understanding that this acknowledgement was not just about completing tasks. It was about her persistence, courage, and ability to navigate the complex dynamics of the ranch. Emily spent the following days preparing for a small change she had been considering for weeks. She wanted to help the ranch become an even better place for workers, where fear and tension were minimized and cooperation and respect were prioritized. She proposed a few ideas to Mr. Dalton, changes in workflow, communication strategies, and small acts of recognition for workers. To her relief, he listened thoughtfully, asking questions and considering her suggestions. This was another sign of progress, another indication that change was possible when approached with care and insight. In the final weeks of her time at Dalton Ranch, Emily reflected on her personal growth. She had faced fear directly, spoken her truth, and observed the consequences of both courage and caution. She had seen how small actions could influence larger dynamics, how honesty could shift power, and how perseverance could inspire change. Emily realized that she was no longer just a worker on the ranch. She was an agent of influence, capable of navigating challenges and creating positive outcomes. When the day came for Emily to leave Dalton Ranch, she felt a mixture of sadness and pride. She had grown attached to the land, the animals, and even the people she had worked alongside. Yet, she also knew that she was ready for the next chapter of her life. She packed her belongings carefully, saying goodbye to Sarah, Jason, and the other workers. Each goodbye carried a sense of gratitude and recognition, a silent acknowledgement of shared experiences and mutual growth. As she walked away from the ranch, Emily looked back one last time. The field stretched out before her, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. She felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that she had faced fear, influenced her environment, and contributed to meaningful change. Dalton Ranch was no longer a place dominated by tension and intimidation. It was a place where courage, observation, and persistence had made a difference. Emily stepped onto the road beyond the ranch, feeling the weight of her experience and the promise of her future. She had learned that life was not always easy, that challenges would arise, and that fear would sometimes accompany growth. But she had also learned that courage, integrity, and persistence could shape outcomes, inspire others, and create meaningful change. The story of Dalton Ranch and of Emily's journey within it came to a close not with a dramatic resolution but with quiet transformation. The ranch would continue to operate, workers would continue their tasks, and challenges would continue to arise. Yet Emily's influence remained, a subtle, powerful reminder that courage and honesty could ripple outward, changing the world one thoughtful action at a time. As Emily walked toward her new future, she carried with her the lessons of Dalton Ranch, the strength to face fear, the wisdom to observe and act carefully, and the understanding that even small acts of courage could create lasting impact. The calm after the storm was not simply a pause, it was a foundation for a stronger, more confident, and hopeful life. And with that knowledge, Emily stepped forward, ready for whatever the world beyond Dalton Ranch had in store.